Hello, travelers of the old trails. If the sound of spurs and the smell of gunpowder spark your curiosity, stick around. Today, we're riding through a Wild West that's quite different from the one Hollywood sold us. Get ready to uncover 25 myths that turned into truths through word of mouth, but fall apart once the dust settles. Along the way, you'll see how high noon shootouts, unbeatable sheriffs, and barroom brawls are mostly just made-up stories. Want to ride with us down this trail that separates fact from fiction? Then go ahead and hit that like button. And if you're not part of our posse yet, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. That way, every time a new episode drops, you'll be the first to draw your curiosity. We've still got a long road ahead, and every stop promises a surprise. Number 1. When we think of the Old West, the image that usually comes to mind is a cowboy in a Stetson hat silhouetted against the sunset. But if we go back to the dusty trails of the 19th century, we'll see a more diverse and way less polished picture. In the early decades, hats were all about function. They had to protect from the sun, the rain, and not fly off in the first gust of wind. That's why the go-to headgear was the bowler hat, imported from England and known as the derby. There were also leftover military caps from the Civil War, wide-brimmed sombreros borrowed from Mexican cowboys, and even flat caps, simple and cheap. It wasn't until much later that the Stetson boss of the plains showed up, with its flat brim and high crown, looking nothing like the crumpled style we see in the movies. So how did it become the symbol of the cowboy? Credit goes to Buffalo Bill's traveling shows, catalog ads, and the visual code invented by Hollywood. Light hat for the hero, dark hat for the villain. The result? A myth that stood the test of time, even though few real cowhands wore that style on the job. Number 2. Ever notice how in old westerns the main character always shows up clean-shaven, hat perfectly in place, and coat free of dust? Yeah, that picture-perfect look only became truth because the camera said so. Real life out on the American frontier was a whole lot rougher. During long cattle drives, the crew would spend weeks crossing rivers, dry plains, and sandstorms. Water was for drinking and for the cattle first. Only if there was any left would someone even think about washing up. Razors were hard to come by, and trying to sharpen one on a saddle could easily lead to an accident. The result? Thick beards and bushy mustaches were the unofficial uniform, along with grease-stained shirts and cheap pants picked for durability, not looks. When the crew finally made it to town, a visit to the barber was a must, almost like a reward after so many nights sleeping under the stars. It wasn't until the 1940s, when big movie studios started looking for marketable faces, that smooth skin was treated like a badge of bravery. And just like that, a shiny myth replaced the dust, rusty spurs, and the smell of the corral, making it easy to forget that real heroes rarely had the time or water to shave. Number 3. When we think of westerns, the image that pops into our heads is usually a white gunslinger with a crumpled hat and a fast horse. Hollywood locked in that version, but the real frontier was a much more colorful mix. After the Civil War, men newly freed from slavery saw cattle trails as a shot at earning a wage. Estimates say 1 in every 4 cowboys was black. Under that same sun, Hispanic cowboys, direct descendants of Mexican vaqueros, drove herds, popularized roping, saddles, and even the word rodeo. By the late 1800s, they may have made up a third of the men moving cattle from Texas to Kansas. Native peoples, masters of horsemanship, were also part of the trail crews, and Chinese immigrants, after building the railroads, swapped pickaxes for spurs. Still, dime novels and early films stuck with white heroes and reduced minorities to stereotypes, reflecting the prejudices of the time. That's how the Old West got whitewashed on screen, even though off-screen it stayed vibrant, just waiting to be rediscovered. Number 4. Have you ever pictured cowboys as towering figures like John Wayne dominating the screen? That larger-than-life image was born more in movie studios than out on the dusty plains of the Old West. Historical records show the average cowboy barely hit 5'5" inches and weighed between 120 and 150 pounds. That light build wasn't a coincidence. to handle endless hours in the saddle, often riding small, fast ponies. A compact body was a real advantage. The smaller the rider, the less strain on the horse and the more stamina to cross deserts and drive cattle. Still, when Hollywood needed bigger-than-life heroes, they went with tall actors with broad shoulders, shaping a myth that replaced reality. The result? Generations grew up linking courage and skill with size, not realizing that out on the range, it was the lighter guys who came out on top. Number 5. That classic scene of the cowboy with a revolver on his hip, finger tapping the holster, waiting for the next challenger. It came more from the writer's room than the dusty fields of the West. In day-to-day life, most of these men were, first and foremost, ranch hands. They had to saddle horses, fix fences, and drive cattle for miles. Jobs where a pistol banging against your thigh just got in the way. On top of being uncomfortable, guns were expensive, and the models back then jammed pretty often. Many ranch owners, knowing the risk of accidental fire around the herd, didn't allow weapons during work. When protection was actually needed, cowboys reached for rifles or shotguns, good for scaring off coyotes or hunting dinner, not for staging sunset duels. That's why, on a real cowboy's belt, you were more likely to see a well-braided rope, a hammer for quick repairs, and maybe a general use knife. The gun-slinging cowboy weighed down with metal, so common in dime novels and on the big screen, owes more to studio lights than prairie dust. Number 6. Time to break down the myth. When people think of cowboys, they picture smoking revolvers, damsels in distress, and songs at sunset. But real life was more about the creak of the saddle than the glitz of the saloon. Cowboys were up before sunrise, shaking the dust off their hats and driving cattle across endless miles of dry pasture. They earned pennies, sometimes less than $1 a day, barely enough for weak coffee and a worn-out blanket. Cold rain, tricky rivers, hooves that kicked without warning. The real danger came from the herd itself. Whole days could go by without hearing another voice besides the cattle's mooing. Loneliness was a constant companion. Records show more broken bones from spooked calves than bullets from shootouts. That heroic image came later, stitched together by writers who chose made-up action over the stubborn dust of real ranch life. Number 7. Did you know that the bond between cowboy and horse that Hollywood sells is more legend than fact? In the real Old West, most cowboys rode horses that belonged to the ranch owner. These horses were part of the ranch's inventory and got swapped out like a saddle or a rope. And we're not talking about towering steeds with flowing manes. The heavy lifting was done on small, tough, fast ponies, perfect for cutting through herds without running out of steam. That image of the lone man and his loyal companion looks great on a movie poster, but it was born far from the dust of the plains. And that's just one of the myths we've still got to bust. Number 8. Take a look at classic westerns. As soon as the camera shows the silhouette of a painted horse at dusk, the shootout with hostile Indians kicks off. That constant tension makes for great entertainment, but it rarely matched the daily grind of those driving massive herds through the desert. Cowboys had to saddle up before sunrise, cross swollen rivers, and count cattle by nightfall. There wasn't exactly time to lay siege to villages. The major violent campaigns were led by the army, which acted to clear land and make way for railroads and towns. That face-off between cowboy and native, repeated so often on screen, came more from the need to create a recognizable enemy than from the actual historical record, oversimplifying a broad and uneven process. Number 9. Contrary to what Hollywood westerns keep pushing, frontier towns weren't drowning in chaos. Places like Dodge City and Tombstone had their share of trouble now and then, but everyday life was a lot less dramatic. Miners and railroad workers wanted peace so they could make a living, which is why every new settlement made sure to set up its own rules. Sheriffs, temporary deputies, and even neighbor committees formed patrols, locked up drunks, and settled disputes before things got out of hand. Shootouts? They made headlines precisely because they were so rare. In fact, many town halls required visitors to check their guns at the saloon door. The big screen loves to sell the idea of a lawless land because gunfire and shouting sell more tickets. Number 10. Time to bust this myth. That high noon scene with two gunslingers frozen on a dusty street is pretty much pure Hollywood fiction. In the real Old West, prearranged showdowns were rare. The Hickok-Tut duel is one of the few recorded exceptions. Real bullets usually flew without warning, sparked by arguments in saloons or ambushes in tight alleys. Anyone drawing a gun would dive behind wagons or bar counters. Standing out in the open meant a closed casket. Even the word gunslinger didn't show up until later, made up by screenwriters in the 1920s. The showdown in the sun is more about grabbing the audience's attention than telling it like it really was. Number 11. You've heard of the shootout at the OK Corral, right? Well, the first surprise is, it didn't actually happen at the corral. On the morning of October 26, 1881, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday and Company exchanged gunfire in a narrow dirt alley next to C.S. Fly's photography studio in Tombstone, Arizona. It lasted about 30 seconds and just a handful of shots were fired, but the noise still echoes today. The title, Gunfight at the OK Corral, stuck because it sounds heroic and easy to market. The perfect label for dramatized biographies and Hollywood films. Number 12. Ever heard that old six-shooters were unbeatable precision machines? That reputation doesn't really hold up. Loaded with black powder, they fired heavy bullets that moved pretty slowly. Because of that, their effective range rarely went beyond 50 feet. If the target stood still, great. But one step farther and it all came down to luck. To make matters worse, misfires were common, and sometimes the cylinder would even explode, a risk that made shooters nervous about their own gear. When someone really needed something reliable, they ditched the holster for a shotgun or rifle, built to shoot farther and hit harder. That classic scene where the hero shoots the gun out of the bad guy's hand? Total myth. Lead bullets back then would just crumble on impact with metal, making that kind of trick impossible. Wyatt Earp put it best. Speed helps, but aim is what really counts. Number 13. You've seen that classic Western scene where chairs go flying and pianists duck behind the keys, right? Well, reality came through a different door. Saloons were busy places, full of clinking glasses and card games at every table. But the last thing the owner wanted was to replace the bar every week. To protect their investment, a lot of saloons banned weapons at the door, hired big guys to keep the peace, and shut down any hint of trouble before it got out of hand. When a brawl did break out, it usually came from personal grudges mixed with alcohol. It didn't last long and was quickly handled. That dramatic choreography of broken chairs and bodies flying through the air was cooked up in movie studios to keep the action moving, not on the creaky floorboards of the real Old West. Number 14. When people talk about the Old West, the image that pops up is the cowardly sheriff, controlled by the richest rancher in the county. That setup clears the way for the lone gunslinger to ride in, fix everything, and move on. But the reality wasn't so black and white. Sure, there were times when groups like the Texas Rangers went too far, and some officials traded their badges for favors. But those were the exceptions, not the rule. Day to day, sheriffs walked dusty streets, broke up saloon fights, and kept thieves in check. Towns that wanted to grow knew a strong sense of order meant open businesses and quieter nights. And it's in that gap between myth and real life that the next curious fact really stands out. Number 15. When the court seemed to be asleep at the wheel, vigilantes would step in, groups promising to handle things on the spot. It sounded simple. Gather the neighbors, point out the guilty party, and carry out the punishment right then and there. But the line between protection and mob rage blurred fast. In 1856, for example, San Francisco saw 6,000 men build gallows, hang suspects, and force officials to resign, all without a judge or a defense. Without due process, grudges turned into sentences, and fear became the only law that mattered. That rush for instant justice is still around today. Every time the system seems slow or corrupt, people start calling for someone to handle it now. But history warns us that this shortcut almost always swaps the gavel for a rope and leaves behind scars no law can heal quite so fast. Number 16. The gold rush is often remembered as a fast track to getting rich. Just bend down, pick up some nuggets, and celebrate. Hollywood helped fuel that fantasy, but the reality was a lot different. By the time the wave of 49ers hit California, the shiny metal on the surface was already gone. What was left was digging through gravel, spending long days under brutal sun and freezing nights, all for a handful of gold dust, if you were lucky. While miners broke their backs, merchants set up shop and charged sky-high prices for shovels, canvas, beans, and even water. That's where the real money was. The ones selling supplies made more than the ones doing the digging. Before long, big companies got permits to dredge rivers, pushing the solo prospectors into rougher and more remote areas. Most people went home with blisters, debt, and memories of a lucky few, keeping the myth of instant riches alive. Number 17. For a long time, people kept saying that horseback was the only way to get from point A to point B in the Old West. Sounds epic, sure, but it doesn't hold up when you take a closer look at history. As the 19th century moved on, railroad tracks started cutting across the plains, linking Atlantic ports to the new towns popping up near the Rocky Mountains. Steam locomotives pulled cars packed with people, cattle, and supplies, turning what used to be weeks of travel into days. And even before the steel rails, bumpy stagecoaches were already kicking up dust, carrying mail, gold, and anxious passengers down rough roads. So the lone rider shared the landscape with train whistles and wagon wheels. He stuck around as a symbol of independence, but he was never the only part of the real picture. Number 18. Every time an old western shows a dusty street, there it is. That dry, rolling tumbleweed spinning in the wind, like it's part of the soul of the American desert. The scene feels authentic, but it hides a lesser-known detail. The most famous tumbleweed, nicknamed Russian thistle, wasn't native to the Great Plains at all. It crossed the ocean hidden in sacks of flaxseed from Russia around 1870, mixed in with shipments headed to pioneer farms. Once it hit the ground, it found the perfect climate to spread. It broke through barriers, invaded train tracks, cattle fences, and freshly planted fields. Within a few decades, it had become a full-blown pest, covering open land even while many of the towns we now call the Classic West were just putting up their first saloons. Today, there are several types of salsola across the U.S., all of them foreign. But the look of those spiny balls rolling across the land caught on so hard in movies that it became an instant shortcut for saying, "You're in the West." Number 19. When we think of the Old West, we usually picture a parade of dusty gunslingers, high noon showdowns, and smoke-filled saloons. But what if we told you that classic scene leaves out nearly a third of its true main characters? Across the vast plains, thousands of women made their mark with their own signatures. They claimed land under the Homestead Act, loaded mail bags onto mules, and learned to draw just as fast as any outsider. Mary Stagecoach Mary Fields blazed trails delivering letters to remote outposts, while Annie Oakley turned gunpowder into showbiz. Calamity Jane roamed forts and tent cities, renting out her sharpshooting skills. Along the way, writer Mourning Dove recorded native legends that still fuel the region's folklore. Others, like Charlotte Charlie Parkhurst, wore men's hats to drive stagecoaches. In a West still taking shape, public colleges opened their doors to both genders, and some counties let women vote long before the Constitution said they could. The frontier, for all its danger, made room for those bold enough to step in. To ignore those achievements is to shrink the epic of the West into a monologue, when in truth it was written in many voices and often they were women's. Number 20. Masked bandits jumping onto speeding trains might seem everywhere in the Hollywood version of the Old West, but reality ran on a different track. From 1866 to 1910, historians count fewer than 1,000 attempted train robberies in the U.S., an average of about 20 a year. And not all of them happened out west. Bank heists, another Western staple, were even rarer. So why does that image stick around? The spark came in 1903. The Great Train Robbery packed theaters, proving that racing locomotives offered instant suspense, a visible loot, and a dramatic getaway. Perfect ingredients for Hollywood, which turned every stretch of track into a stage for legend. Number 21. Ever notice how, in old westerns, you could tell who the good guy was and who the bad guy was just by the color of their hat? The white hat versus black hat cliché had little to do with Texas dust, and everything to do with Hollywood logic. Between the 1920s and 1940s, black and white film directors needed a quick visual cue that would stand out during chaotic fight scenes, and the contrast of hat colors solved the problem instantly. Early films like The Great Train Robbery spread the idea until it started to feel like Old West tradition. But outside the studios, cowboys picked hats that shielded them from the sun, fit their budget, or were just whatever was available. Never to signal virtue or villainy. That code was made for the camera, and it ended up becoming legend. Number 22. The old idea that all Native Americans were bloodthirsty warriors stuck around for decades, thanks to dime novels and westerns that kept repeating it. Like every village was just a trap waiting to ambush the next wagon train. But the truth points in a different direction. We're talking about hundreds of nations, each with its own language, rituals, and decision-making systems. When weapons were raised, it was usually because a treaty had been broken, a sacred river blocked, or a group of prospectors pushed past agreed boundaries. The label Indian, born from Columbus's mistake, lumped together peoples as different as the Cherokee and the Haida, and set the stage for a colonial story that needed a simple enemy. Even intertribal conflicts, which had existed long before the first European ship, were pulled out of context to prop up the myth of constant aggression. That way, politicians found a reason to push borders. Businessmen cleared the way for railroads, and behind the scenes, shows like Buffalo Bills and early Hollywood reels got themselves a convenient, highly profitable villain. Number 23. The lone cowboy who rides in, fixes everything, and rides out is pure myth. The American frontier only moved forward because the work was shared. Huge cattle drives crossed deserts led by lines of cowboys. Wagons traveled in convoys that split up watch shifts, repairs, and navigation. Pioneers formed land associations to protect their crops. Mining camps wrote up contracts to divide risks and profits. Families, neighbors, and strangers became partners in taming a tough land. The image of the lone wolf sticks around because it makes the story simpler. But the West was built by hands reaching out to help one another. And every alliance mattered. Without them, there'd be no trail, no bridge, no town. Number 24. You've probably heard that Jesse James lived out a Robin Hood story. The legend says he robbed from the rich to ease the suffering of the poor. It's a tempting tale, but 19th century records tell a very different story. Newspapers sympathetic to the former Confederate guerrilla helped spread the myth, but the gang's ledgers show no donations, only personal expenses. Their targets were banks and trains tied to companies that backed their enemies, and every hit left bodies behind. Like most outlaws in that rough Western era, James was after profit and revenge, not charity. Still, the story sticks in the public's imagination because it's comforting. When the thief brings down the powerful, the crime starts to feel like a kind of justice. Number 25. Have you ever stopped to think about how long the Old West actually lasted? A lot of people imagine most of the 19th century filled with sunset shootouts and loud stagecoaches crossing the desert. But the real stretch was much shorter, just over 3 decades. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the frontier was still a blurry line on the map. In the years that followed, makeshift towns popped up in the dust. Cattle trails pushed massive herds across the plains, and gunmen made names for themselves in wooden saloons. Meanwhile, railroads were slicing through the land, and tensions with native nations grew with every mile. It all happened so fast that by 1890 the government declared the frontier closed. And in 1893, historian Frederick Jackson Turner said the era was over. Still, that short burst of time left scenes vivid enough to fill books, movies, and legends, making it feel like it lasted way more than 30 years. We've reached the end of our journey through the Old West, and the real landscape we uncovered looks pretty different from that land of flawless gunslingers Hollywood made famous. Behind the "Wanted" posters were cowboys of Mexican, African American, and Native heritage, sleeping under the stars after exhausting days. There were towns writing laws to protect saloons, schools, and families. There were women running businesses, inheriting ranches, and often saving entire communities when violence came knocking. These 25 myths aren't just fun facts. They show how the entertainment industry simplifies stories to sell dreams and heroism. Understanding what got left out helps us become more thoughtful viewers, and shines a light on the people who actually built that harsh world. One shaped by cooperation, innovation, and complex struggles that rarely fit into a shootout script. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these truths changed the way you see the West? Drop a comment. Your questions and stories always make the conversation richer. If you enjoyed the ride, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next stop on this history trail. Thanks for riding along, and see you on the next trail.